The proliferation of feminism. This is a Ruth Rosen term referring to the influx of women of color, union women, lesbian women into the movement in the 1970s. They wanted to raise issues of racism, oppression of women, sexual orientation, class, none of which are new issues, but they're being raised by women who held these particular concerns. And what we see is that they formed independent groups around the National Organization of Women, which was no longer one coalition group anymore. Feminists of color, African American women, particularly had the challenge of straddling the line between the civil rights movement and the women's movement. A lot of these African American women resented white women who compared their plight to Black women and felt that the women's movement did not encompass the racial issues that were most important to them at the time. But they came into the movement in the late 70s and 80s because of Black power, that oppressed women in the movement were starting to create their own organizations. And so you see them kind of straddling the line between the civil rights and women's movement. And Black feminist voices started coming out in the later 1970s and 1980s, like Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, and most famously maybe Angela Davis, who we have pictured here. And she, in a way, was a powerful female voice for the Black power movement and the struggles that she felt. How could she put race and gender aside from each other? They were one sort of issue for her. The Black Women's Liberation Committee came about in the 1970s as well to focus on not only race and gender, but also third world issues. Frances Beale, who was the founder of the Black Women's Liberation Committee, came up with the term double jeopardy to express this sort of double oppression that women of color felt. They were oppressed because of their gender and then also because of the color of their skin. And therefore, there would need to be a separate movement or separate organizations that would address those unique challenges. We see the proliferation of Latinas and a Latina feminist movement. That a lot of these women were coming from Catholic background. They were anti-abortion, many of them, and the women's movement was community, La Raza in 1970, focusing on more of the youth. So there are many varieties and streams of the Chicana movement, depending on the region. But in 1969, at the Denver Youth Conference, during the special women's caucus there, and the women of this workshop stated that it was the consensus of the group that Chicana women did not want to be liberated. Questioning wrote about the triple oppression that existed for some women. Not only are they oppressed because of their gender, because of their race or ethnicity, but also because of their class. So even jumping off of this double jeopardy concept and adding class as part of it as well. The Puerto Rican Young Board Party Asian American women, really focusing on local issues, mostly especially local chapters in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And a huge focus for these groups were to challenge some of the negative stereotypes about Asia. For Native American women, we see them working along with the American Indian movement and doing some demonstrations to call attention to Wounded Knee, the takeover of Alcatraz, and so really focusing on broken treaties between the U.S. government and the tribal system from way back in the day. But women were bringing their own unique voice to the American Indian movement, focusing on issues of forced sterilization that were particular to these women. For working class women, they worked on union issues, work issues. In 1974, they brought the Coalition of Labor Union Women into existence and sought equality in the workplaces, really focusing on affirmative action and getting more women into what considered to be male-dominated industries. So using affirmative action to their benefit, and really increasing these women and their participation into politics. We see lesbians forming their own sort of separate wing of the women's liberation. Even though they had been part of women's liberation, there was still some of that underlying homophobia. And, lesbians argued that lesbianism was the complete female autonomy. So we see sort of a resistance to some of the mainstream gender constructs that existed, especially in more of the conservative organizations like NOW. In 1969, the Stonewall riots in New York City that became really the launching of the gay and lesbian movement, really threw lesbian feminism into its own sort of wing of women's liberation. One historian has called the decline of feminism the tragic ironies. This is what Sarah Evans talks about, that women had more options than ever by the 1970s, but female-headed households were poorer. There's an economic depression in the 1970s, and women still had few choices outside of female low-wage labor, which included things like teaching, clerical work, nursing. Along those same lines, divorce rates increased to nearly 50% by the mid-70s, and it left women with less money, despite divorce laws becoming more equitable. Marriage rates started increasing. 1 in 6 women didn't marry at all. The average marrying age in 1960 was 20.3 years. In 1970, the average age was 20.8. In 1980, the average age was 22. In 1984, the average age was 23. In 2000, that went up to 25 years of age for women, and in 2010, the average age was 26 for women. So women continued to complain about the double burden of working and taking care of the home, despite husbands helping out more. By 1980s, 51% of women were working outside of the home. There was a cultural acceptance that women were no longer belonging primarily or solely in the home. But at the same time, we see the emergence of a new right movement that was anti-feminist, it was anti-ERA, it was pro-life. This especially was energized after the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade in 1973, which legalized abortion. And they considered themselves the moral majority. They wanted to bring the American public back into a much more Protestant Christian focused center. In 1972, Phyllis Schlafly, who's pictured here, forms the Stop ERA group and claims that feminists were anti-women, and they rejected womanhood and their God-given rights. She, in a way, was bringing back the idea that women should embrace their biological differences from men and stop trying to be more like men and sort of accept that women and men have differences and they should be okay with that. In 1977, the International Year of Women Conference was held in Houston, Texas. And this, in a way, kind of shows where the women's movement goes from here. It developed a feminist agenda for countries around the world. So it definitely had a third world focus on kind of expanding what had been done in the United States and trying to bring that worldwide to bring greater equality to women around the world. But there was also this wing of conservative anti-ERA women there too, like Phyllis Schlafly. So overall, we see this kind of bringing us in some ways to where we see the women's movement of the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, and 2000, up until today, that there continued to be this split in the women's movement. There is the wing that is more focused on equality, and then there is a wing that is more focused on difference.